a strange and almost laughable set of beliefs, followed by dedicated lunatics who had been brainwashed, a power-hungry scam artist posing as a guru, all of the promises of special powers and spiritual healing amounting to nothing. Such is the promise of Aum Shinrikyo, Japan's most dangerous cult. March 2nd, 1955. Yatsuhiro City in Kumamoto Prefecture, Japan. A boy is born to a family of poor tatami mat makers. Like his older and younger brothers, he was born with congenital glaucoma and was only partly sighted in his right eye. No one knew it at the time, but this baby boy named Matsumoto Chizuo would grow up to be one of post-war Japan's most evil men. From an early age, he had a love of cartoons, watching the television every chance he could. However, by the age of 6, he was sent to live at a boarding school for the blind alongside his 2 brothers. None of the Matsumoto brothers were ever visited by their family after being sent there. It was as though they no longer existed. Given that he was one of the few sighted students, Matsumoto took time to take advantage of the other students. He would torment them and threaten the other students if they didn't go along with his plans, or give him money to buy sweets. The love of his parents and family was replaced almost exclusively with a love of money and power over other people. From an early age, he even spoke of a desire to rule over an empire of robots, who followed his every whim. At first, this was exhibited as a dream to become a doctor, but then as a desire to take part in politics. He idolized the so-called Shadow Shogun Prime Minister Tanaka Kakue, and also Mao Zedong. Later in life, he would describe Mao as, quote, connected to God. His attempts to run in student elections over his years of schooling all failed, given that he couldn't see who people voted for. Democracy, who needs it? When he turned 20 in March of 1975, he graduated from the school, departing for Tokyo to enter Tokyo University. This failed, and he returned to his hometown 6 months later, tail between his legs. His older brother had become a massage therapist, a traditional job for a blind person in Japan. He had become an acupuncturist for a time until he attacked a former employee for talking bad about his brother. His older brother was the only person he'd ever respected. After the attack, he began to consider things more, and decided that he either wanted to enter law or become a religious leader. Matsumoto's second attempt to enter Tokyo University failed again. However, there he met the woman he would marry, Matsumoto Tomoko. Thereafter, he moved to Chiba Prefecture near Tokyo and ran an acupuncture and later traditional Chinese medicine shop. He wasn't happy with his life, however, and began to research esoteric and occult teachings. His focus of study ranged from traditional forms of fortune-telling to Taoist Neidan, aka internal alchemy. Matsumoto also began to research new religions in Japan, briefly joining the fire-focused Buddhist new religion of Agonshu to delve deeper in his religious studies. There was trouble in paradise, however. In 1980, he was forced to repay money from improper health insurance billing, and in 1982, he was arrested for selling unlicensed quack pharmaceuticals and received a heavy fine. Rather than deter him, this only accelerated his path into religious lunacy. The Yoga Sutras of Patanjali caught his eye. Soon, he was practicing yoga and doing everything he could to learn about it, receiving the first name Shoko from a religious leader named Nishiyama Shozen. Yoga was and still is something that's foreign to Japan. Ultimately, the conception of Aum Shinrikyo's ideology was almost entirely foreign, actually. Yoga, Hinduism, Tibetan Buddhism, and dashes of Eastern and Western occultism flavor the religion, if you can call it that. This would influence the cult's approach, giving followers pseudo-Sanskrit holy names and often using English words to make things extra exciting, and implementing various science fiction-esque flourishes that call back to his favorite cartoons. In 1983, Matsumoto Shoko left Agonshu and took the name Asahara Shoko. His new venture was a private yoga studio where he worked to merge Eastern traditional medicine, Kundalini yoga, and Eastern occultism into one concept. Even from the beginning, he claimed to be able to heal illnesses and be able to teach people how to acquire psychic powers. At first, Asahara only had a small group of people who got together to do yoga, and his group had no religious overtones to it. One of his first recruits during this time was a woman named Ida Eriko. Ida worked as a model for Asahara's scam health products and would introduce Aum's other most important woman to Asahara, Ishi Hisako. Ishi and Ida worked at the same place, so she was invited to the yoga studio. Ishi took an instant liking to Asahara and was the first to become a religious disciple of his, even becoming his lover and birthing several of his children. Ishi was also the public face of Aum outside of Asahara and presented a kind, feminine face for potential recruits. It would be fair to say, though, that Ida Eriko was far more important for She was pretty much a genius, much more so than many of the scientists that later ended up recruiting later on. Ida Eriko was less public, but managed most of Aum's financial and business affairs. In fact, it's fair to say that Ida built into the business juggernaut that it would become later on. Without these two early recruits, Asahara would have never gotten as big as he did. By 1985, the group began to take on a religious and increasingly bizarre occult angle. This was showcased in the very first time Aum Shinrikyo showed up in the press, in the occult magazine called Mu. Named after the supposed hidden continent of Mu, the magazine was the culmination of the 1970s occult boom in Japan that was kicked off with the publishing of the Prophecies of Nostradamus by Ben Goto. I'll be honest in saying that I'm not sure if Mu is half serious in the way the National Enquirer is, or if it's a serious. Many clearly did treat it seriously, and Asahara submitted an article to the magazine entitled "The Fabled Ultra-Ancient Metal Hihi Irogane is Real?" Hihi Irogane was a special mystical ore that was invented whole cloth in 1910 by occultist Takeuchi Kiyomaro. Takeuchi invented something like 40 special ancient emperors in his own fake pre-modern Japanese script and stories about Jesus visiting Japan and being buried there. Yes, the grave of Jesus in Japan thing is his handiwork. For the most part in the article, however, Asahara discusses a different figure, Sakai Katsutoki. Startlingly, Sakai thought the Japanese people were the lost tribe of Jews. Yes, really. Though Sakai was actually pro-Jewish, Asahara was strongly anti-Jewish and was also anti-Freemason. Asahara believed that the three S's, that is, sex, screen, aka television, and sports, were devised by Jews and Freemasons to destroy people spiritually. In general, science and modern life was hated by Asahara, well, except for cartoons, nudie mags of his favorite actress, and science fiction laser weapons. Asahara also claimed that Japanese people were descendants of the Shakya tribe, and were chosen by God, and that would save them, and all of those sorts of crazy nonsense, a sort of inversion of the lost tribe story of Israel that Sakai had latched onto. Soon he also published a photo showing off his supposed levitation abilities. Now obviously this isn't him actually levitating in the way you'd expect, but likely taken during a yogic flying, which is a nice way of saying that you look like a 7-year-old with ADHD. This photo and photos similar to it were plastered in a variety of magazines over the years, and Asahara benefited greatly from being given free press where most of the audience would laugh at him, but few would be taken in by him. This sort of exploitative laugh at the weirdo content that newspapers and TVs would unfortunately do did help out quite a bit, in addition to his large variety of published content. In the mid-80s, he went to India and claimed to reach nirvana while praying there, making him a spiritual master and proper guru. Thus, he was no longer capable of generating karma and was to be obeyed at all times. This mindset would later be used as justification to explain hypocrisy to followers, and ultimately, to justify murder. With his newfound nirvana, Asahara began to develop the religious aspect of his group more, providing the organizational aspect, referring to each level of the priesthood with the English stage, or stagey. Members who joined the priesthood of Aum, then known as Aum no Kai, had to donate their belongings to the group and retire from secular life. To the surprise of no one, members were frequently threatened into joining Aum's priesthood to steal their wealth. Asahara had, as of 1985, been more or less openly speaking about nuclear war and the end of the world. Asahara had also been talking about overthrowing the government to establish a Shambhala in Japan. For some reason, no one seemed to care. Pro tip, if a guy keeps talking about Armageddon and his former cult, don't trust him. He's bad. For the Asahara, or rather the Matsumoto family, things were actually quite happy in these days. They would sit around and have vegetable barbecues, as eating meat was forbidden. In fact, even killing insects or pests was considered wrong, though his wife, who hadn't converted yet, would often swat away flies. This was all in spite of the fact that he would sometimes give followers privileges to eat meat as rewards and develop the concept of poa, religiously sanctioned violence that redeemed both the soul of the killer and the victim. Hypocrisy was common in Aum, and the rules only existed to justify abuse. In 1987, Aum Shinrikyo finally took shape. However, it needed to be certified as a religion by the Japanese government to take advantage of the tax status that it would confer. It's about that money. While they waited for approval, something terrible happened. Many of Aum's rituals were aggressive and painful for practitioners. Yoga can be painful just by itself, so imagine doing it underwater or upside down. Other methods of worship, if you can call it that, were more like punishments than anything else, like being hung upside down by a rope or something called thermotherapy. This is where practitioners were forced to sit in the saunas and then forced to drink a scalding hot concoction several times over. To the surprise of no one, both practices resulted in deaths. Then, there were the punishments, such as being kept in a small, musty, closet-like room. Other than the cockroaches, the only thing that was there to keep you company was the brainwashing tape of Asahara, playing at the highest volume over and over again for weeks on end. Former followers say that after Asahara's wife Tomoko was put in one, she, quote, went back to normal and no longer had any of her mental illnesses that she suffered from. In addition to these rituals, there were special ceremonies that could transfer some of Asahara's energy to his followers. These were called initiations. Beyond the Shaktipat, which is where power is transferred via touching the forehead, a typical scam employed by fraudulent gurus, by 1988 they had developed their first special initiation, allowing followers to drink a concoction made with Asahara's blood, if you paid them over $5,000. But it was during an extreme training session when things went all wrong. An adherent started acting erratically. Asahara ordered him calmed, so cult members took him into a bathroom and held him underwater in the bathtub. He drowned. The body was burnt to hide the evidence. Fear of the incident leaking out meant that when a follower tried to leave a few months later, Asahara was quick to order them strangled. Now killing, known internally as Poa, had become something Asahara could order whenever he wished. The taboo of murder had vanished. Aum's accidental death and subsequent murder incidents remained undetected. So the legal status of a religion was approved for Aum Shinrikyo. Now it was legit. With this, the demands for donations began and they never stopped. Even if you didn't enter the priesthood, they would try and suck out all the money you had away from you. And they weren't afraid of twisting arms to get what they wanted. This is when Aum's plans for national and international expansion began, even expanding into New York City in spite of Asahara's anti-Americanism. Plans were drawn up for the creation of Lotus Villages, which were intended to be self-sufficient communes filled with everything you could ever need, even fallout shelters. This Lotus Village concept actually never took off in Japan, and around this time the process of creating the businesses was started by Ida Eriko, utilizing donations for funding. Aum had a series of computer shops, software development agencies, medical companies, temporary hiring agencies, a babysitting agency, publishing house, restaurants, and so on. The restaurants were really the most eye-raising part of the whole Aum business empire, with some of the menus offering good value and some even featuring an anime Asahara. Supposedly the food was also quite good. This of course contrasts the meager vegetarian diets given to Aum members, oftentimes not sanitary or fresh. Working conditions were poor and the workers were overworked, barely sleeping more than 3 hours a night. They had become slaves. While these businesses helped make money, some of them offered other benefits. The restaurant was a way to recruit college students, various medical companies who were fronts to acquire chemicals and land, and the software development companies took government contracts to develop software for important systems. In fact, the number of companies Aum Shinrikyo had meant that some of them actually survived long after Asahara's arrest, and the software work they did for the government remained unknown until much later on. Back then, things were still small, but they were growing fast, going from 35 in 1986 to around 4,000 in 1989. However, there was trouble in paradise. Again. By 1989, criticism was starting to come out about Aum Shinrikyo. A follower had contacted his mother with the intention of leaving the cult, and his mother contacted the reporter Egawa Shoko. Egawa referred them to the noted anti-cult lawyer Sakamoto Tsutsumi. Soon the stories of Aum essentially kidnapping youths and preventing them from contacting their families began to spread. This resulted in the serialized story done by Sunday Mainichi entitled Aum Shinrikyo's Madness. Asahara did the smart, PR-friendly thing and immediately ordered that Mainichi Shimbun's headquarters be blown up with a truck bomb. Ultimately, the truck was too big to fit in the underground parking garage of the building, so the plot was foiled, and the follow-up attempt also failed. It would be funny if it wasn't so serious. Not long after, the Aum Shinrikyo's Victim Association was formed with Sakamoto Tsutsumi at its head. Negotiations between the association and Aum representatives quickly fizzled out, and a lawsuit seemed imminent. You can see where this is going. The media firestorm attracted TBS News, who began taking interviews for a segment about the situation. As part of the segment, Sakamoto was interviewed and he spoke frankly about his opinions about both Aum Shinrikyo and its leader, Asahara. Somehow, Aum managed not just to get the segment cancelled, They also managed to get a chance to watch Sakamoto's interview. TBS didn't protect its sources, and as a result, now Sakamoto was in Aum's crosshairs. Aum members broke into Sakamoto's house and beat him, his wife, and his infant son, and then injected them with potassium cyanide to finish them off. The bodies were placed in drums and hidden in 3 different locations across Japan. Issues with jurisdiction caused the case to drop quickly, and people began to say that Sakamoto and his family simply went into hiding to avoid loan sharks. In the end, their bodies wouldn't be recovered until the arrest of Asahara. In contrast to TBS was Egawa Shoko herself. As a reporter, Egawa continued to take on Aum head-on, both on the press and on television. She narrowly avoided getting assassinated herself several times. But things fizzled out. Aum had managed to survive the crisis of 1989. At the same time that he was ordering the deaths of entire families, Asahara was planning his entry into politics. Asahara had created the Shinrikyo, or Party of Truth. The group's campaign was odd, making songs. Aum had a lot of songs, usually sung by Asahara himself. Shoko, 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 Asahara Shoko. Other than the giant Shoko mascots, the so-called Aum sisters campaigned alongside him. All 4 sisters had been converted to Aum Shinrikyo. Asahara was keenly aware of the marketing value of cute girls, and even wanted to make one of his daughters into a pop star to advertise for the cult. The terrible failure of his political campaigning led him to plotting botulism and phosgene gas bomb attacks. In fact, from here, the plans for mass production of chemical and biological weapons begin. There were even plans for kidnapping and brainwashing members of the Japanese Self-Defense Force. Asahara probably would have continued with his crazy plans, but a particular incident stopped him. In 1990, they bought a large tract of land through a dummy corporation. But soon, the sale trickled out to the village residents. They raised a fuss and got the law involved. While it didn't result in much legally, a raid that they were tipped off about almost resulted in the discovery of their secret weapons research work that had already begun. If they didn't have a member inside the Kumamoto police, things would have ended very bad for them. Thus, Aum changed tactics away from open confrontation with the authorities to something different. This ended up being Aum's boom time. At its peak, Aum Shinrikyo had 15,000 members in Japan and an estimated 30,000 in Russia. Yes, you heard that right, Russia. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, a new and more unrestricted country was opening up, and Aum wanted to sink its teeth into it. After paying a bribe to Russian politician Oleg Lobov, Aum had secured high-ranking contacts in the Russian government. When Asahara visited Moscow with 300 of his followers, he met prominent politicians like Alexander Rotskoy and spoke at a variety of important educational institutions such as the Kurchatov Institute. This was Russia's leading nuclear energy institute. He even managed to get several adherents there. Asahara made big donations while in Russia to the Orthodox Church and held a musical at the state Kremlin Palace. They even assembled a master orchestra in the country. Soon, a Moscow headquarters was established and advertising time was bought on Radio Moscow and on Russian television. Aum continued to grow unabated in Russia. Whatever abuses that did occur, they were never looked into by authorities. By 1993 in Russia, they even began to build several of these lotus villages, unlike in Japan. At home in Japan, Asahara had become something of a media darling. Though he was always brought on as the weird guy to riff off of, Asahara began to develop genuine contacts in the Japanese media and academic world, even interviewing with Beat Takeshi.
とりあえずいらっしゃるということで、
ちょっと覗いてみましょうか。
オウム真理教のですね、孫子朝原翔子さん、今控室の方に。よろしくお願いします。
朝原さんどうも。
はい、よろしくお願いします。
During this time, they even started to engage in sports, forming a running team and running in marathons. Once again, please ignore the teachings on sports. Now it's okay to do sports. Asahara said so. Asahara had become famous in Japan and saw growth all over the country, focusing on recruiting on college campuses as per usual, but taking in anyone they could get. While Aum had some of the cream of the crop when it came to Japanese intellectuals, they also had runaways and others who just didn't fit in. About 1/3 were college educated and another third had only about a high school education. Somehow, Asahara had become the face of a new wave of new religions in Japan, alongside Okara Ryuho and his Happy Science. Asahara hated Happy Science and Ikeda Daisuke's Soka Gakkai. Both organizations' leaders were later targeted for assassination by Aum Shinrikyo. Of course, in spite of their massive growth, that didn't mean that Asahara had no longer wanted to kill people. Part of their work in Russia included buying weapons, most of this occurring later in 1994. Not only did they collect plasma, laser, and microwave technology, They even bought helicopter and rocket launchers, though their primary purchase was of a lot of AK-74 rifles. They even had plans to buy a fighter jet, T-72 tanks, a submarine, and a torpedo boat. In addition to this, they seemingly acquired information on how to produce sarin gas. Soon, at the Satyan headquarters, sarin gas production began in 1993. This was later joined by other types of weapons of mass destruction soon after. To facilitate further testing, bought a cattle station in Western Australia. Exactly what they did there is unknown, but at the site, there were plenty of sheep bones left behind and evidence of sarin use. In addition to this, there are rumors of uranium mining and a nuclear test at the site, though you'd think if they did this, the radiation would be a dead giveaway. After the seizure of the assets of a metal tool working company from a believer, had all the tools necessary to begin to mass manufacture weapons and create their own weapon shops. All told, they made thousands of rifles and an untold amount of ammunition by the time of the Sarin incident. Japanese police later tested these guns and said that they were comparable in build quality to the actual AK-74s from Russia. I'm not sure if that's complimenting handiwork or disparaging Russia's. None of the other plasma or laser weapon programs actually ever worked. In fact, the plasma weapon was to be named the Satellite Reflection Gun, which happens to be the same name as a weapon from the anime Space Battleship Yamamoto. By the way, speaking of Aum Shinrikyo and anime, as mentioned earlier, Asahara was a huge anime fan, particularly of science fiction anime. Space Battleship Yamamoto, Future Boy Conan, Nausicaa Valley of the Wind, and so on. For the sake of propaganda, the manga and anime team, aka MAT, was created. They produced a seemingly popular but very ugly manga and several animated adventures, including 10 episodes of an anime entitled Transcendental World. None of the anime projects were well known by any measure until after the Tokyo subway sarin incident. However, in spite of all of the growth his new strategy was giving him, Asahara was starting to tire of the nice guy routine by 1993. He was starting to lose it mentally, or rather, lose it more mentally. Asahara got even more erratic and violent, thinking that the US was attacking him with poison gas and even putting a Faraday cage in his limousine. His initiations also got more extreme, giving his energy to his followers in increasingly strange ways. In 1993, they injected blood into their foreheads, began using electronic machines that mimicked Asahara's brainwaves to brainwash the believers, used drugs like LSD or truth serums in increasingly strange and drug-centric brainwashing initiations. One of the most extreme was the so-called Christ initiation. This form of initiation involves giving believers LSD drinks and locking them up for a week in an isolation cell, with nothing but Asahara's sermons playing at max volume. The most repulsive of these initiations was a technique known as the left-hand tantra initiation. This is about to get really dark, just as a heads up, so I'll leave a time on the screen where you can skip to if you want. Taking inspiration from other fraudster gurus, Asahara practiced the ancient yogic art of assault on many, many women. While he had engaged in assault by forcing himself on young girls or by convincing him that it had some sort of special meaning, it wasn't until 1993 that the process became formalized as Dakini. Like most Aum Shinrikyo stuff, the word is only tangentially related to its original meaning. These Dakinis were almost always young girls. In fact, he preferred virgins and actually ordered the collection of these young girls for his enjoyment like they were toys. All told, he had no less than 30 and would often take 10 at a time, reportedly using LSD in some of the acts he inflicted upon them. In many individual cases of his one-on-one initiations, his wife, Tomoko, would loiter outside the room, incapable to bring herself to stop what was going on inside. Asahara is rumored to have had relations with around 100 women in his organization at one point or another, and has had at least 15 children by 4 women, though it's likely that he had more. None of this satiated him, however. He was only ever getting more violent. Several members died from accidents stemming from punishments, others were killed under the claim that they were spies, and several people were killed as part of trying to leave the organization. No one was ever allowed to leave. By 1993, Asahara had ordered the production of sarin to be sped up. By August of that year, sarin had successfully been produced, and soon a full-scale production plant would be operational. However, these new weapons had to be tested. In Tokyo, sprayed anthrax, but all it did was create a bad smell. They tried to spray from a car to assassinate Soka Gakkai leader Ikeda Daisuke, but the sprayer failed and instead one of the drivers almost died from exposure. They even tried to poison lawyer Takimoto Taro, who had produced a copy of Asahara's levitation photo. The first attempt failed, and then the second when they put sarin on the car handle because he was wearing gloves, and then the third attempt failed when they tried to swab botulism toxin on the glass. With the sprayer systems not working, it seems like they just didn't know how to use the weapons that they had produced. Unfortunately, Aum's experiments in sprayers did eventually bear fruit, resulting in a box truck with a sprayer system mounted in the back, and the results were deadly. In Matsumoto City of Nagano Prefecture, there was an ongoing legal struggle between and the city authorities. No one wanted to build a dojo there, but Asahara and tried to force their way through legally. Though the case looked like it would wrap up in favor, they didn't feel like taking a chance, so they decided to cause a big incident to distract the court. A sprayer truck and a station wagon filled with members arrived in Matsumoto after the court had closed, so instead they targeted the dormitory for the Matsumoto Nagano District Court. They parked in a residential area and began to spray. Asahara and didn't care how indiscriminate sarin was as a weapon, even though the area they were targeting was filled with homes and dormitories of private companies. They just didn't care. About 50 minutes later, they finished spraying and drove away. With the gas silently circulating around the community, people began to die while they slept. 7 were killed in the attack and a further 600 were injured. People were shocked by the incident and the police were quick to focus in on the obvious suspects. Kono Yoshiyuki, a victim of the incident, whose wife had been put into a coma by the sarin gas. He was the first caller to the police in the incident. He had some agricultural chemicals at his residence, but none of them could have made sarin. So someone from the police decided to leak that Kono was the suspect, and it quickly became a media circus with all the sorts of commentary about how Kono was certainly trying to kill his wife. That's why he decided to dump sarin into the neighborhood. Makes sense. Makes tons of sense. Towards the end of the year, a new document began to circulate, having been sent anonymously to the police and the media. A study on the Matsumoto Sarin Incident drew connections from the sarin attack in Matsumoto directly to Aum Shinrikyo, which at the time was not known to have sarin gas. This was insider information, or an incredibly lucky guess. In fact, the writer actually forewarned of the potential of an attack on an enclosed space, warning against an attack potentially on the Tokyo Dome or the Tokyo subway system. There are many theories about who was behind this note. Was it perhaps an insider in the cult? Well, the document does actually get several guesses right and does actually provide their own opinions about various Aum Shinrikyo figures. The number of people who knew about the sarin program were small. Was it perhaps some sort of security expert who wanted to remain anonymous? Perhaps, but it was written in a sort of inappropriate way and it had jokes in there. It wasn't very professionally done. Or was it perhaps a random guy? Maybe a hoaxer? There's a chance, but the information about trains and chemical weapons included perhaps suggests a much deeper knowledge of the subject material than the average person. There's a fourth theory, that a police spy was writing this as a warning from the inside of But then again, why write so unprofessionally and why circulate it out to the media? And if it was a police spy, that means that they failed to prevent the later Tokyo subway sarin gas attacks. We never found out about who wrote the letter. It remains unsolved to this very day. While the media stalked Kono, continued doing evil, kidnapping several people and forcing them to stay in poisoning suspected spies, trying to poison Egawa Shoko and the head of the Victims Association with VX gas, and so on. Paired with the brazen break-ins and a flagrant murder of a notary shop owner, it was clear that they thought that they were invincible, until Yomiuri Shimbun had their big scoop. The reveal that sarin residue was discovered at one of the compounds kind of made the whole thing obvious. Soon the police were investigating the front companies used to purchase the various chemicals used to make sarin. They were closing in on and it was pretty much an open secret that was up to bad stuff. Rumors began to swirl about a police investigation in search of property, one that would doom the cult. Asahara demanded that the evidence be destroyed, but there was simply too much of it to fully hide it all. However, did get a break in the form of a great Hanshin earthquake. Over 6,000 people were killed and the whole of the Hanshin Kansai region was tossed into chaos. This meant that the properties of were not searched, but they all knew that the searchers would be coming soon. To delay a search, they decided to make an incident. Botulinum toxin was used in an attempted attack at Kasumigaseki Station, but the sprayer in a briefcase only emitted steam rather than the toxin. So on March 18th, after an event at an restaurant, while on his limo, Asahara and a number of close associates began to discuss what to do. They reasoned that another incident like the Hanshin Great Earthquake would stop a search, and believed that the authorities already knew that they had done the sarin attack in Matsumoto. So, Aum's mad scientist and astrophysicist, Murai Hideo, argued that producing more sarin and using it would scare off the authorities from taking action against them, which is a really wild thing to think. In fact, most of Aum's really wild terrorism ideas come from Murai Hideo originally. Asahara agreed, in order that the gas attacks be carried out, and that false flag attacks against Aum also be carried out to increase sympathy for the cult. These false flag attacks occurred on the night of March 19th. This idea of using false flags also extended to the main attack by using JCP or Soka Gakkai newspapers, and this was implemented during the subway sarin attacks, though no one was swayed by either attempt. Aum No. 2, Murai Hideo, gathered a group of top-level members and began to plot out the attack.
The plot?
The plan was to target trains heading into Kasumigaseki Station during rush hour. Kasumigaseki is in the heart of the central Chiyoda Ward, and is close by to many local Tokyo and national governmental buildings such as the Ministry of Justice, Internal Affairs, among many others. However, on the 19th, little action was taken other than gathering supplies and disguises and preparing the new batch of sarin. With a purity of only about 35%, there was a chance that the attack could be postponed. This was put right to bed once Asahara scolded them and demanded faster progress, saying that they can stop if they're not motivated. But no one left the plot. The men moved out to the Shibuya hideout, grinding down the tips of umbrellas to poke packets of sarin infused with Asahara's energy. The men fell asleep that night well aware that they were going to kill many people the following day.
私は手となり足となりあるいは頭となり救済計画の手伝いをしてくれることを待っている。さあ一緒に救済計画を行おう。そして悔いのない死を迎えようではないか。The incident.
March 20th, 7:44 a.m. Yokoyama Masato pierced one of his sarin packets at Yotsuya Station and escaped. Unlike the others that immediately had an effect, Yokoyama's sarin didn't spread as much and would actually end up not killing anyone. However, at 7:53, the least enthusiastic sprayer, Hayashi Yasuo, pierced his packet at Akihabara Station and escaped. Hayashi unfortunately had 3 packets of sarin rather than the 2 the rest of them had. Not only did he pierce his packet the most times, but the middle of the 3 packets somehow also broke open. As soon as he pierced the packet, the sarin was immediately overpowering. People began to fall ill, and the situation became chaotic fast. No one was sure exactly what was going on. At the next stop, Kodamacho, a passenger kicked the sarin packet out of the train and onto the station. Unknowingly, this was the worst possible thing they could have done. In kicking the packet, they not only spread the sarin to Kodamacho Station, they had also aggravated it into the air. Now in the train, liquid sarin remained, and it was still circulating throughout the air and on the clothes of the passengers. And at the station, sarin continued to circulate, kicked up into the air by the air pressure of the passing subway trains. Hirose Kenichi pierced the packet at Ochanomizu Station. This spray is less effective as well, and the train didn't stop running until later on. Around 8 a.m., Toyoro Toru pierced his packet while nearing Ibisu Station. The packet proves to be more effective. Within a few minutes, in between Roppongi Station and Kamiyacho, people begin to smell a strange odor. They open the window, but several passengers collapse. When they arrive at Kamiyacho, the driver notified station staff and they took the victims to the hospital. But the situation was getting much worse. Slightly after Toyoro Toru, at 8:02, Hayashi Ikuo pierced his packet at Shin Ochanomizu Station. By 8:09, the train arrived at Kasumigaseki Station, and the station staff removed the sarin packet before sending the train on its way. Once it arrived at the next stop, it had to stop service given the number of people that were getting sick. Unknowingly, the station staff that removed the sarin packet on the train were heavily exposed to sarin and wouldn't survive. At 8:10, the train where the packet had been kicked off arrived at Tsukiji Station. The sarin was still on the train and was wreaking havoc in the train car, and a passenger pressed the emergency button. The train driver immediately reported the situation and noted the white smoke billowing from one of the train cars. Immediately, speculation about the subway and that it had been bombed began to circulate. Witnesses said it looked like a battlefield, with people collapsing all over as sarin began to take hold of them and shut down their bodies. Soon, first responders began to arrive. Not knowing about the gas, many of them were exposed to sarin. In fact, Many people were exposed to sarin over the course of the day. Sarin stuck on people's clothes and decontamination occurred at hospitals, not at the scene, meaning that people tracked it all over the metro and to their work. Ambulances weren't ready for the scale of the disaster either, so even good Samaritans driving people to the hospital were exposed. In fact, hospital doctors and nurses were also exposed to the sarin gas particulates. Soon, thankfully, a gas analyzer doesn't reveal that the gas is sarin, but does show that it's a chemical, and so orders to wear gas masks are released. At 8:30, the first news of the incident begins to be broadcast on television. Soon, most television stations except NHK's educational TV would be broadcasting live about the incident. Until the day Asahara was arrested, TV broadcast and newspapers fixated on Aum and the incident. By 9 a.m., the National Police Agency had set up a police task force to deal with the situation and deployed as many officers as possible to the capital, fearing additional attacks. Less than 30 minutes later, all train service in Tokyo was suspended. On the Hibiya line, like the other lines, people were forced to evacuate from the trains and platforms. One of the popular spots for the Hibiya line to evacuate at? Koremacho Station, directly into the area, swirling with sarin. Over 2,000 people would be exposed to the sarin sprayed by Hayashi Yasuo, and 8 would die, resulting in the nickname Walking Murder Machine being given to him by the press. It took time for people to get help. It wasn't immediately obvious that it was sarin, but thankfully a professor recognized the symptoms of the victims as similar to the victims of the Matsumoto Sarin Incident, and so they faxed the treatment information to hospitals in Tokyo. The police would later formally confirm that it was sarin at 11 a.m. By 12:50, the Tokyo governor requested help from the Japanese Self-Defense Force, and soon the Chemical Protection Platoon arrived to begin decontamination. Decontamination work continued into the night. Meanwhile, at the Shibuya hideout, the sprayers and the getaway drivers celebrated. One of the drivers, Mimito Mitsu, was overjoyed when he heard the news that people had died. Asahara praised their actions as Poa that redeemed both them and the victims, and then ordered that they chant a mantra 10,000 times. You might think that the situation was over, but you would be wrong. There was still a very pressing issue: antidotes. Curing the effects of sarin isn't easy and requires 2 things, one called parloxidome and atropine sulfate. I'm probably on a list for trying to look all of this up, by the way. They were able to use these drugs and experimental measures to keep some people alive, but they very quickly ran out, not having nearly enough stock in Tokyo to help everyone out. Unless reserves were found, dozens could die over the course of the day. Thankfully, sarin is an organophosphate. I have no clue what any of this means, but they are used in agricultural pesticides, at least in Japan. The company Sumitomo Pharmaceuticals manufactured both chemicals as antidotes for their pesticides out of a sense of responsibility to produce it in spite of the fact that they were previously losing money on the product. The antidote was gathered from a pharmaceutical wholesaler who gathered up all the antidote stocks from each sales office, hospital, and clinic along the Shinkansen route they sent their stock to Tokyo on. Without that stroke of luck, the death toll would have been much, much higher. Only 11 had died over the course of a month, with most dying in the first 2 days. However, those exposed to sarin were often robbed of the quality of their airsight and severely raised their risk for certain cancers. Over the years, an additional 3 victims have been added to the death toll, one as recently as 2020. Given Yomiuri's scoop earlier in the year, it meant that pretty much everybody was convinced Aum Shinrikyo had done it. The cult put people on television and even drove Asahara's limo around in diversionary movements in an attempt to stop the inevitable. But it was clear that they couldn't stop the coming raid. 2 days after the incident, the police searched 25 cult facilities. The scale of Aum's chemical weapons and AK-74 production was laid bare, but it gave little in the way of direct evidence of Aum doing the sarin gas attacks. No sarin was recovered, just the chemical parts to make it. Now you're probably going to be surprised by this, but this didn't immediately lead to the arrest of Asahara, and so on being arrested. No, the cult was both too big to immediately raid, and the Japanese police would rather leave a suspect free and under surveillance than immediately arrest them before a case could be built. The process of breaking up the cult and shutting down its compounds would take months, as they flailed about attempting to provide excuses for what had happened. They tried to blame the trace sarin and chemicals on US gas attacks against them, and that they were using the compound to produce pesticides, or that it was a conspiracy of the politician Ozawa Ichiro. Now, while Ozawa is one of the most hated politicians in Japan, I don't buy it. This led to a weird situation where they tried to make nice to the media. They even let a reporter into one of their compounds. He walked around and enjoyed the scenery and even smelled a vat of liquid that was later revealed to be an LSD concoction. Wow, talk about a contact high. Morai Hideo, hoping to protect his master, even ordered new terror attacks, although none succeeded. Morai was a guy hated by pretty much everybody, given that he was a nerd with no social skills. Regardless, his intelligence and knowledge was useful, and so was his deep dedication. In fact, after he participated in the murder of the Sakamoto family, Morai didn't hesitate to burn away his fingerprints with a hot frying pan. Given that Asahara was locked down in his compound, Morai had become the spokesman for the cult after the Sarin incident. Given the extreme level of interest in the story, Morai had often given press conferences. Before one of these press conferences, on April 23rd, Morai was stabbed to death in front of a crowd. With Morai's death, Asahara had not just lost his most loyal follower, he had also lost the guy he intended to use as a patsy. Yes, he did intend to knife him, unintended, and throw him under the bus. On May 6th, Hayashi Ikuo, who had been arrested and held on an unrelated bicycle theft, confessed to taking part in the sarin gas attack. With Hayashi's help, the police were able to legally conclude that had done the incident and that it was ordered by Asahara. As a result of his confession and acting as a witness, the former doctor, Hayashi Ikuo, is the only spreader of sarin to still be alive. On May 16th, the raid on the main compound was undertaken. Asahara was found in a hidden compartment, sitting inside a sleeping bag along with a fat stack of 10 million yen in cash. Asahara was charged in 17 cases with 26 murders, 5 attempted murders, 2 desecration of a corpse charges, 1 false imprisonment resulting in death charge, and a variety of drug and weapons charges. The drug charges were later dropped. While Judge Abe Fumihiro had declared that he wanted the trial over in less than 5 years, instead what would unfold was one of Japan's longest legal dramas, with the final trial related to the subway sarin gas attacks not being settled until 2018. Asahara quickly changed his legal representative, and his defense embraced a dual-pronged strategy. Firstly, shifting any and all blame to his followers, and secondly, gumming up the trial. In fact, the prosecution questioning of the witnesses totaled 206 hours, and the defense's questioning was over 1,000 hours long. His lawyer also suggested that he try levitation in front of the court, but while he practiced, he was never able to get it to work, sadly. I guess. During the first part of the trial, he was very talkative and wouldn't shut up, in fact, ending up being admonished by the judge many times. He would often speak in broken English rather than Japanese as well, saying absurd things like his wife's grandfather was the founder of the Unification Church, or that there were special laws in Japan so a man could have multiple wives. In fact, he had attempted to put the responsibility on his followers in almost all cases with the exception of a few. In regards to the Sakamoto family murder, he claimed, absurdly, that because there were 6 participants, that he would only be 1/6 at fault and thus not guilty somehow. Part of this was as a gradual escalation of his apparent mental illness. His blindness, which seemed to change in severity depending on how it could benefit him, and his eccentric behavior grew deeper and more severe with the passage of time. This increased drastically after the calling of his former followers as witnesses. Most of his followers began to turn on him and testify. In the case of Inoue Yoshihiro, this upset him greatly, and he tried to stop the trial in an outburst, even demanding that Inoue levitate for the court. One theory is that his increasing eccentricity was the result of retreating into a fantasy world after his closest followers deserted him. That seems to be the case. As time went on, he became stranger and stranger still, eventually talking less but losing control of his bowel functions. He had to wear diapers and would regularly have to change his pants as he would soil himself often. By 2002, he simply stopped speaking in court or much at all. On February 23rd, 2004, after 3,000 days, since he was first arrested, a death sentence was handed down. He reacted by shouting, "Why, damn it?" which was a rare moment of mental lucidity, suggesting that his eccentricities were a ploy. By this point, Aum Shinrikyo had already been dissolved by the government, and the various successor organizations were busy fighting each other. Legal battles over Asahara's competence certainly didn't help. Since 2004, he had been remanded to a private cell in a solitary confinement block, kept in an isolated part of the block for housing HIV patients and drug addicts. Asahara would lay in his own feces and urine, sometimes painting on the wall with his own excrement. His primary pastime behind bars was masturbation, which he did openly during visitations, including when his daughters visited. Following the conclusion of the trial of the final defendant in the Tokyo subway sarin gas attack, on July 6, 2018, Asahara was executed. He left behind no last words. It feels fitting that for a man who spoke so many lies, that in the end when it counted most, he had nothing left to say. A strange and almost laughable set of beliefs, followed by dedicated lunatics who had been brainwashed, a power-hungry scam artist posing as a guru, all of the promises of special powers and spiritual healing amounting to nothing, common features in many cults. Sadly, in human history, there have been many of these heinous groups. As for Aum Shinrikyo, in the end, it was all just part of Asahara's sick and twisted desires. It had no meaning. It had no purpose. It was pure evil. Such is the promise of Aum Shinrikyo, Japan's most dangerous cult.
Shoko, 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 Asahara Shoko. Shoko, 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 Asahara Shoko. 中野のShoko、杉並のShoko、消費税違廃止だShoko、Shoko。光を浴びて今立ち上がる若き血潮に応援しようみんなの暮らしを守るために力を合わせて押し上げようShoko、Shoko、消費税廃止Shoko、Shoko、Shoko、Shoko、Shoko、Asahara Shoko、Shoko、Shoko、Shoko、Shoko、Shoko、Asahara Shoko。渋谷のShoko、中野のShoko、教育改革だShoko、Shoko。子供の暮らしを守るために今立ち上がる若き力子供の心を育むためにあなたの応援が必要だShoko、Shoko、教育改革
Whoa, this video was a doozy. I actually had to rewrite the entire script because my final copy of it got messed up. Thankfully, it was easier to do the second time. If you liked the video, please leave a like and maybe share it with someone else who might also enjoy it. If you have a comment, feel free to leave one down below. If you want to support me further, the links are in the description. Thank you for your consideration. Also, do check out my Twitch. I usually stream on Wednesdays, Fridays, Saturdays, and sometimes Sundays, typically starting at around 2 PM EST. I typically post my VODs at Charlie Dogwood Live, so you can check them out there if you're interested. Without further ado, check out this video. It's pretty good. Good stories only. Thank you.